Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Federico Talks Watches. Today, I'm going to talk about three watches you absolutely should not buy if you're a beginner collector. Three watches, or three types of watches, that I've seen watch newbies have a lot of trouble with because they just don't understand them or they're not ready for them yet. But of course, before we get started, customary wristwatch check. Today I'm wearing my Panerai Luminor Daylight Chronograph. Have not worn it in a very long time, but took it out of the box today. I'm going to give this one a little bit of a run around. It's getting a little cooler in Miami, so maybe switching back to straps slowly. Also, guys, don't forget to check out delraywatch.com. A bunch of new watches in stock. The most watches that have ever landed in a single week have been put up in the past couple of days. I mean, 30 new pieces, but three of them that I want to highlight is we got in the very popular and newly released Maurice Lacroix Icon in every single flavor. A nice little Genta-esque feeling without the Genta price. A Grand Seiko Snowflake Spring Drive in beautiful condition. And an IWC Pilot's Chronograph, which, I think everybody's thought of at least once. I'm not saying you bought one, but everybody's thought of an IWC Pilot's watch at least once. At least that is my theory. That's at delraywatch.com, link in the description below. So yeah, guys, today I'm going to talk about the worst types of watches, or three of the worst types of watches you could buy or be given or receive as a new collector. As somebody new in automatic watches in particular, things that may leave a bad taste in your mouth, because let's face it, we were all newbies at one point. Maybe you're not a newbie now, probably not because you've been watching me, but everybody was a newbie at some point, and these may sound pretty easy to you, but you'd be surprised, 10 years in the industry, how many times I've seen complaints about these issues. Not necessarily because of the watch, but because the person was new and he didn't get the appropriate watch to begin his journey. The first one I'm going to talk about is Valjoux 7750 powered chronographs. My Panerai has the 7750. Longines uses 7750. Some Omegas, Breitlings. Probably the most ubiquitous 7750 chronograph movement out there. Also, one of the very worst for new collectors. Two particular reasons. The first one is a very small reason. It's got the rotor wobble. If you're not used to automatic watches, the 7750 is a very loud movement. You can feel it move. A lot of people actually think it's broken, whereas it's just the way it is. It's a unidirectional winder. But the main reason is the date change. So on a 7750, you shouldn't change the date conservatively between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m. When the hands are between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m., the date function is engaged, and by quick setting it, you can actually break or jam it. So the safest way to set the date, at least what I do, because I never remember, and I do this with all chronographs, because a lot of chronographs have this quirk. Not all of them do, but a lot of them do. I always just set the hands on the southern hemisphere of the dial. So I set it to like 6, doesn't matter if it's 6 a.m. or 6 p.m. And I set the date. There's no chance of the date function being engaged. But you would be surprised, particularly because the 7750 is usually in, not always, but usually in lower priced chronographs. So I know a lot of people buy Longines to start out, a nice Longines chrono, Baume & Mercier chrono. Next thing you know, 2 months later, they come back, hey, Fed, the date doesn't work. I'm like, well, when did you change the date? And they explain it, and, they broke it themselves. Particularly, it's not something that's always explained to the customer. So I think a 7750 is an awful first watch, not only because of the quirkiness of, the characteristics of the loudness of the movement, but also is the date change, which is not something you usually learn either until you break the date, or you've been in the watch hobby a little bit and you hear other people talk about it and you're like, and then you remember. So 7750s, even though they're in a lot of beginner priced or lower end or lower priced chronographs, not great for first time watch buyers. Next, and I'm going to get shit for this, but I don't care. I stand behind it. Vintage watches. I think vintage watches are awful for first-time buyers or newbie watch buyers. Why? Well, you can't just put it on and forget it. Most vintage watches are not waterproof, like in swimming, but they're not water resistant, most vintage watches. Most vintage watches have a large variance in timekeeping. So when you're coming from an iPhone or a quartz watch, which is accurate to a second a week, and you strap on a vintage watch, which is running well at 15 seconds a day, it's a little bit of a shock. Not to mention, vintage watches can also be fragile. Plexiglass crystals, thinner construction, just watches you need to take care of a little bit more. And now I'm not saying you shouldn't like vintage watches, even though I'll come out and say it, I'm not the biggest vintage watch guy. I do not think it is the right place to start your journey, unless, of course, you have researched it very heavily. But I always recommend somebody start off with something modern, and then if you got the vintage bug, go for it, but be aware, it's a very different experience. Now, last is one which kind of relates to the Valjoux 7750, and that is perpetual calendars. Federico, but what newbies buy perpetual calendars? You'd be surprised. At Wempy, I sold dozens, if not hundreds, of perpetual calendars to people that had never had an automatic watch. Now, it goes twofold. First, you have the setting issue. You can only set the dates at certain times, depending on the perpetual calendar, or you can break the mechanism. But another issue is that sometimes, for example, in IWC, if you go too far ahead while setting the perpetual calendar, you have to wait for time to catch up. And if you go too far ahead by like months or even years, then it's going to cost you over $1,000 to get the date reset by a watchmaker or to send back at IWC. They're highly complex machines. They're a pain in the butt to set. They're complicated to understand. And even though, you probably think I'm crazy for including it, it's common sense. Of course, a newbie wouldn't get a perpetual calendar. You'd be surprised. I've been doing this a long time, and trust me, it's not as rare as you might think. But in conclusion, I think the best watches for beginners are just something water-resistant, modern, and sturdy with the least amount of complications as possible. Has nothing to do with price. If this person is extremely rich, then you know what? A gold Submariner at $35,000. That's a great first watch because, once again, water-resistant, sturdy, and modern. If it's a more humble budget, then get a nice automatic Tissot or a Seiko. Nothing wrong with that. Once again, sturdy, non-complicated, and water-resistant. I think those characteristics are probably the best to go for newbies. Not vintage, not 7750 chronos, or any chronos, but particularly 7750 chronos. And of course, perpetual calendars / high complications. Anyway, guys, please give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. It really does help. And please don't forget to subscribe if you haven't missed any content. Or rather, so you don't miss any content. Guys, thank you so much, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.